know YouTube doesn't necessarily like showing firearms on videos. This is an animation, and it's kind of a, you can see through it, which I think is pretty cool. If I make this full screen, I think you can see it pretty well. Okay. Um, so this is a P226. Just so everybody knows, uh, the P226 comes in a variety of calibers, as they list them right here. Remember the unspent round that we found in the probable cause affidavit is a 40 caliber, which this one that we're about to watch is a 9mm, but the only difference between that firearm and this firearm is the diameter of the barrel, the breech. And again, let's identify some of the parts here. This is the barrel. This big piece of metal right here is the breech. And anything holding the round itself. Those things are going to be different depending on the calibers, but what's not going to be different is the firing mechanism, the firing pin, and just the mechanisms that extract and reload. So we're quickly going to watch this, and I'd just like to point out before we start, you can notice this piece of metal right here, where my cursor is. This is known as the extractor, and you'll see why in a second here as I press play. So this is the beginning of the cycle, right? The round gets jammed up into the breech here, this big piece of metal, and this piece of metal is made out of hardened steel, okay? It's designed to be able to contain the crazy amounts of pressure that happen when you actually fire a bullet through it. So it's made out of hardened metal. And you can see that this slide, as it comes back, it forces the round into the gun, and it slides on the bottom of this wedge-shaped breech. And that sliding motion, so remember, the casing of the round is brass, okay? This is hardened steel. So when the brass scrapes up against that hardened steel and forces that round into the breech, it's going to leave markings on the case. And I saw someone in the chat earlier say, all firearms of the same model will make the same marks, and that's true to an extent. When you first purchase a firearm, we're going to get into this when we look at the paper, there are different marks that the firearm will make on a round. As you use the firearm, every firearm wears in a unique way. And what I mean by that is it wears out. The more you fire it, the more wear your firearm will get, and they wear in unique ways. So the lines that this breech put onto this brass casing here can potentially be unique, okay? And we're not going to say that that's the only thing that happens, because let's watch the rest of this animation. As it shoves it forward into the breech, you can see how much force it looked like was put into that, okay? So you're going to get some impressions all around that brass. It's a soft metal, right? And now you'll notice this thing I talked about earlier, the extractor. It has a little hook on the end of it right here that sinks into this recess behind the back end of this projectile here. There's a small recess that this hook sinks into, and you can notice the gap here on the breech is just placed in a way where the hook can rest inside that recess, okay? And where this hook rests against the brass in there is also going to make a little mark, what's known as a tool mark. Let's continue on. In this animation, the round is fired, which does not apply to our scenario, but I will explain really quickly. This motion of the slide coming back after the round is fired typically is caused by the pressurized gases inside that occur when you ignite the propellant inside of the cartridge. So those gases push the slide back. In our case, what's alleged is that Richard Allen used his hand to mimic the same motion that the slide would make if you fired it, but he did not fire it. So as he pulls the slide back with his hand, the mechanism in which the slide is moving back is different, but the result is the same. So as it moves back, you can see this hook is still hooked inside behind that rim of the casing, right? And as it comes back, it's pulling the spent round out of the chamber. As it comes back to here, maybe a little more right here. Oops. Oh no. Okay. Let me try to get back to that same point. Ah, you know what? We can go right from there. Let's bring this back just to here. Sorry, you guys, I messed up. Okay, so right here you can kind of see it's a bad angle. The other angle I had it set up at was better. But behind here, there's another piece of metal. You know what? I have to get to that point. Here we go. Let's just watch it again from here. Okay, it's pulled back, and right here you can see there's another piece of metal right here, separate from the extractor, that's going to make contact with the back end of this cartridge as it's being pulled out quickly. It's being pulled out quickly. And when this casing hits this piece of metal, it's going to launch it out the hole this way. Okay, you'll see that happen in 1 second. Boom, it hits the piece of metal and it launches it out and up. And then the cycle is repeated. Okay, you can see the piece of metal here. Once this round goes up into the chamber, when it comes back out, it's going to make connection with this piece of metal right here and launch it out. That impact will also leave a mark on, potentially could also leave a mark on the round. No, I think what they're suggesting is that Richard Allen either accidentally pulled that slide back and ejected around, or maybe he did it on purpose to be intimidating. For some reason, he pulled that slide back and caused the round to be ejected from the firearm. Maybe he was unloading his firearm, in which case you'd pull the magazine out and then remove the round. And then maybe he lost it on the ground and he was panicking, so he had to run away. Again, this is all speculation. We don't know what happened. We do know that there was a round found on the ground, unspent, and that the striations and marks left on the casing were enough to link it to Richard Allen's firearm. And that's what I wanted to show you guys here, is how those marks, striations, impressions, maybe they measure from where the hook has marked that recess and where the extracting, I don't know what this piece of the firearm is called, but the piece of metal that it hits to knock it out, maybe you can measure the distance between those 2 points and come up with another unique characteristic. Okay? So now that we kind of understand how those striations and marks could be made on an unspent round, let's go ahead and get this out of here. And now let's talk about ballistics in the courtroom. I'm going to quickly try to go find this source real quick. I really hate talking about a source that I don't have for you guys. So give me 1 second here. Jeez, it's far down. I knew it was a couple days ago, but I didn't realize it was this far down. So let's talk about ballistics in the courtroom. We're going to go with orange. Forensic ballistics is the analysis of bullet and cartridge case evidence. In our case, we're going to be talking about cartridge case evidence, and the use of that evidence to link specimens to each other and to particular weapons, which is what they did in this case. They took a casing, or a bullet, but I believe more specifically the casing of that bullet, and used it to link specifically to Richard Allen's firearm. This paper will attempt to use the term forensic ballistics exclusively. At times, the term ballistics will be used for shorthand. In the world of forensics, a tool mark. It's interesting, that word was mentioned in the affidavit. Refers to any mark left on any object by coming into contact with another harder object. What did we just talk about? The breach of that firearm? Remember, this part of the firearm right here, the breech where the round is sliding up into, that's hardened steel, and the casing is brass. And in fact, the bullet is soft metal as well. We're going to talk about exactly, we're going to talk about exactly how the bullet is labeled in a second here. Okay. Expert criminal laboratory technicians examine shell casings to match identifying marks to particular weapons under the assumption, it's an assumption, but under the assumption that guns leave individually indefinable marks, and if necessary, these experts will testify to that in court. The technique of firearm identification involves the expert examining the marks created on the shell casings, or the bullet, but in this case the shell casings. The bullet and shell casing come from the cartridge, which is made up of 4 main parts. Let me bring over that YouTube video here so we can kind of follow along. You can see this image of this bullet inside this mechanism here. So they're saying it's made up of 4 main parts. You have the bullet, which is the tip of it, the different colored tip here, the casing, which is the part we've been talking about, the powder, which is located inside, and the primer, which is this small circle also located inside of the projectile. So there's 4 main parts of a bullet, in case you didn't know. We today are going to be talking about the case and potentially the bullet, but mostly the case. The case is the covering that holds all of the cartridge components together. They go on to talk about the different parts, but the only one we're really concerned about right now is the casing. Okay, let's move on to page 2. When a bullet is fired, the examiner looks for the marks created by the machined metal on the barrel, the breech, the extractor, and okay, so the firing pin is not going to affect us today because the gun was not fired. But we just explained that casing comes into contact with the machined metal on the barrel, breech, and extractor, regardless of if the firearm is actually fired or not. After examining the projectile, they can make an identification, that's another term we saw on the probable cause affidavit, of the components, concluding that they came from the same source. Okay? Let's remember, the word identification was used in the probable cause affidavit. They concluded that the test rounds in the laboratory and the one found at the crime scene came from the same firearm. Otherwise, he would have said he'd eliminated they did not come from the same source, or that it's inconclusive, right? That they don't know if it's hard to tell. But no. They concluded they made a positive identification. Now, in the parlance of firearm examiners, if there is sufficient agreement to make identification, another phrase we saw in the probable cause, the firearm examiner states that the chance that another firearm could have made the mark is a practical impossibility. The examiner faces the challenge of identifying both class and individual characteristics. And this comes back to, who was it that said something? Mandy, you said vague recollection of something I saw years ago. Markings inside guns manufactured by the same machine progress as each one is manufactured. So that's known as a design features. And these are the challenges that the examiners face when they're talking about these forensic ballistics. That's what the manufacturer intends before the first piece of metal is processed. I'm sorry, I was talking about class characteristics. Now, this class characteristics narrow the identification to a given manufacturer, meaning This firearm was produced by, let's say, Sig Sauer, the P226. Now, all of these firearms that came off of the line at the same time using the same components will have similar class characteristics. So if you find a round on the ground that has these class characteristics, you can safely assume, or safely conclude, I should say, that that round came from this model of firearm by given manufacturer, but not to an individual firearm. That's not enough. Okay? Thousands of firearms share the same class characteristics. Now let's move into subclass characteristics. These are markings that temporarily become part of the manufacturing process and therefore create a marking on perhaps hundreds of weapons in a given production run, though they are not a permanent feature of the design. And what they mean by that is these markings, these tool marks, will wear away as the firearm is used. In effect, subclass characteristics indicate an imperfection in the method used to produce a limited number of firearms. I gotta wake my dog up. He's having a dream. Butter boy. Butter boy. Okay. He can be a very noisy dreamer, so it's best to wake him up now. Okay. Where was I? Subclass characteristics. Limited number of firearms. So those are firearms that come off the same run. They were produced in a small time frame, all of the same time frame in the same factory. Now we're getting into individual characteristics. These characteristics are what I believe they are going to use in the forensics. So individual characteristics are imparted from the actual, bear with me here, piece of the actual tool. Okay? During production. Okay. That's kind of worded a little confusing for me, but I think I understand it. Finally, it's the examiner's task to is further complicated by the facts that accidental characteristics may be found in shell casings fired from the same gun. Again, our gun was not fired. And individual guns' markings can change over time. That's crucial. Marks made at one period may not be there at another. That's crucial because, like I said, all firearms wear. Okay? So if you have a heavily used firearm, the marks it makes earlier in its life are not going to be the same as the marks it makes towards the end of its life. Okay? Everything wears out, especially in the case of firearms. Okay, so in today's world, forensic ballistics expert gather shell casings collected at crime scenes or by test firing guns, which we know they did both times. Well, technically the gun wasn't found at the crime scene. It was found at Richard Allen's house. But they test fired that firearm and collected more shell casings to create ballistic images. And we know that that is an aspect of this crime because as we go on and they talk about some of the history of this ballistic imaging thing, they talk about NIBIN, or the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. So which categorizes records of ballistics recovered from other crime scenes. So I assume they were searching to see if this gun was used in any other crimes. That's all we need from this page. I know I have more pages here, so. They talk about the qualifications of the expert witness. There is a federal rule that they must be qualified as an expert by knowledge, skill, experience, training, and education. And they must demonstrate that to the court. Now we're going to talk about why ballistics evidence, why I believe law enforcement must have more evidence, because I think that you're skating on thin ice if you're going to try to make a conviction based solely on ballistics evidence, okay? And we're going to talk about that right now. Okay. Let's look at this phrase right here. theory underpinning forensic ballistics is that all firearms possess distinctive features that in turn impart distinctive markings or tool marks onto projectiles and cartridge casing. And it goes on to say when the weapon is fired. But again, I demonstrated how that could be the case without it being fired. Using a microscope, which we know they used in this case, firearms examiners compare those tool marks found on projectiles and cartridge casings to determine whether they were fired from a particular weapon, generally by comparing them to ones test fired from a seized weapon, which is what happened in this case. Now into the less happy news about the ballistics, because although forensic ballistics is currently allowed in the courtroom, you have to have the testimony of a qualified or government official or occasionally academic experts. They have to testify that this information is accurate. Okay? And they have to testify that a match to the exclusion of all other weapons in the entire world has been found by their forensic investigation. Again, they talk about how they use the markings on shell casings to match to a particular weapon. And then they prove that the evidence chain of custody links the weapon with the suspect. They did that in this case. Obviously, you assume that the defense would question the expert's experience, but still, the court allows ballistic testimony if the court is satisfied with the evidence and qualifications of the expert. This here is a current admissibility of ballistic evidence as articulated by Massachusetts, and there's 4 different factors here. If it assists the jury in reaching a verdict, the defense counsel has to be furnished with the discovery, the jury is provided necessary background concerning the theory, and an opinion matching a particular firearm. So I think that all 4 of those factors are accounted for in this. And again, that's in Massachusetts Circuit County, but this paper goes on. Last page, I promise. While these factors, While these factors represent one circuit's current acceptance of forensic ballistics evidence, the following cases will provide a short history on challenges to the science. They go on to talk about some different cases and whatnot. So I think it's interesting that there is some, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not as identifiable as, let's say, DNA or a fingerprint. The defense can poke holes in ballistic forensics. So I hope this breakdown of the ballistics evidence gives you all an understanding of, first of all, how those markings could have come to be on the projectile, the casing and the bullet, without firing the weapon. I hope it also brings some attention to the fact that ballistic forensics is not a slam dunk in many cases throughout history. So that'll do it for this video, you guys. Please swing by the next live stream I do if you want to hear this information live and be able to comment, speculate, and theorize with me and the community in the chat. So thanks for sticking around to the end. I appreciate it, and I'll catch you next time.